We live in a world that runs on quiet approvals. Most of the time, we don't even notice them. You open a bank account and feel grateful when it's approved. You send money overseas and accept the delay without question. You swipe a card, tap a phone, click confirm, and trust that the system will say yes. When it does, everything feels normal. When it doesn't, confusion sets in. Sometimes panic. At some point, we were taught that this is just how money works, that finance, by nature, needs gatekeepers. That safety comes from oversight, from institutions watching over every transaction, every account, every movement of value. And so we adapted. We learned to ask politely. We learned to wait. We learned to comply. But underneath that smooth surface lies an uncomfortable truth. In the modern financial system, you don't really own your money in the way you think you do. You are allowed to use it. You are trusted with it. You are granted access to it. But ultimate control sits somewhere else, behind layers of rules, policies, and invisible decision makers. You feel this most clearly when permission is suddenly revoked, an account gets frozen, a transfer is blocked, a payment is reversed. Often there's no explanation that truly satisfies, just a notice, a reference number, a reminder that the system has spoken. In those moments, people don't just lose access to money, they lose a sense of agency. They realize, often for the first time, that what they thought was theirs can be taken out of reach without their consent. This isn't a fringe experience. It happens to individuals, to businesses, to charities, to entire populations. Sometimes it's justified, sometimes it's a mistake, sometimes it's political, sometimes it's simply automated. But the mechanism is always the same. Permission can be withdrawn. And here's the part we rarely talk about. A system that requires permission is not neutral. It cannot be, because someone, somewhere, must decide who gets access and who doesn't, who is trusted and who is flagged, which transactions are acceptable and which are suspicious. Power concentrates naturally in such systems, even when everyone involved has good intentions. Over time, we normalize this arrangement. We tell ourselves that inconvenience is the price of stability, that surveillance is the cost of security, that surrendering a little control is necessary for the greater good. And maybe for a while that feels true, especially if the system works in your favor. But stability built on permission is fragile. It depends on trust in institutions, trust in people, trust in continuity. It assumes the rules won't change suddenly, that those in control will remain fair, competent, and aligned with your interests. History suggests otherwise. Throughout time, money has been one of the most effective tools of control. Not always through force, but through dependency. When access to value can be restricted, behavior can be shaped. Compliance becomes rational. Resistance becomes expensive. Most people never question this because they don't feel directly threatened by it. Not yet. The system feels invisible when it serves you. It only becomes visible when it stops. And when it stops, the question hits hard. Why do I need permission to use what I earned? That question isn't just financial, it's philosophical. It touches something deep inside the human experience. Ownership is not just about possession, it's about autonomy. It's about the right to decide. When that right depends on approval, ownership becomes conditional. This is where the idea of permission quietly reveals its cost. It trains people to outsource responsibility, to trust intermediaries more than themselves, to believe that freedom must always be mediated, supervised, and granted from above. The irony is that many of the systems built to protect people from risk end up protecting themselves first. Rules become rigid, processes become opaque, human judgment gets replaced by checklists and algorithms. And the individual, standing at the edge of the system, feels small. None of this is usually framed as oppression. It doesn't need to be. Control works best when it feels normal, when it feels professional, when it feels inevitable. So we move through life inside this permissioned world, rarely imagining an alternative. Money flows until it doesn't. Access is granted until it isn't. And most of us quietly hope we'll never be the ones on the wrong side of the decision. But every once in a while, a disruptive idea appears. An idea that doesn't ask how to improve the system, but whether the system itself is necessary. An idea that challenges the assumption that permission is the price of order. Before that idea had a name, before it had code, before it had value on a screen, it began as a simple rebellion against a simple truth. If someone else can stop you from using your money, then it was never fully yours to begin with. And that realization sets the stage for everything that follows. Bitcoin did not arrive with a press conference. It didn't ask regulators for approval or banks for cooperation. It didn't promise efficiency, convenience, or user-friendly interfaces. It simply started running. That detail matters more than most people realize. Bitcoin wasn't introduced to the world as a product seeking adoption. It appeared as a system that already worked, indifferent to whether anyone believed in it or not. From the very beginning, it made a quiet but radical statement. Value can move without asking anyone's permission. To understand why this is so disruptive, you have to unlearn what money has taught us. We've been conditioned to think that trust is something institutions provide, that without central authorities, chaos follows. That order must be enforced from the top down. Bitcoin challenges this by flipping the direction of trust. Instead of trusting people, it asks you to trust rules. Instead of believing in institutions, it asks you to verify math. When you send Bitcoin to someone, no one evaluates your intent. No one checks your profile. No one decides whether the transaction is appropriate. The network doesn't care who you are, where you live, or why you're sending value. If you follow the rules, the transaction goes through. If you don't, it doesn't. That's it. This is what permissionless truly means. Not lawless, not reckless, just neutral. Bitcoin doesn't discriminate because it can't. There is no desk to file an appeal with, no department to convince, no human authority capable of overriding the system on a whim. The same rules apply to everyone, every time. In a world where financial systems are deeply entangled with politics, identity, and power, that neutrality is almost unnatural. What makes Bitcoin even more unsettling is that it doesn't rely on trust at all. You don't need to trust the person you're transacting with. You don't need to trust miners, developers, or anyone else in the network. You can verify everything yourself. The ledger is open. The rules are visible. The supply is known in advance. Nothing is hidden behind closed doors. This is a sharp contrast to traditional finance, where transparency is often promised but rarely delivered in full. Balance sheets are adjusted. Policies change. Emergency measures become permanent. The average person is expected to trust that those in control know what they're doing, even when the outcomes suggest otherwise. Bitcoin offers no such comfort. It gives you responsibility instead. There's something deeply human about that trade-off. For the first time, individuals are given a tool that treats them as capable adults rather than potential risks. If you lose your keys, there is no customer support line. If you make a mistake, there is no reversal department. The system doesn't protect you from yourself. Critics see this as a flaw. They argue that people can't be trusted with that level of control. And maybe they're right for some. But the point Bitcoin makes is not that everyone will use freedom well. It's that freedom should exist regardless. Bitcoin doesn't require permission to be held. It doesn't require approval to be transferred. It doesn't require identity to function. These qualities make it uncomfortable for systems built on oversight and control. You can't easily regulate something that doesn't need to ask before acting. Even attempts to ban Bitcoin reveal its nature. Governments can regulate on-ramps and off-ramps, but they can't turn the network off. They can make it harder to access, but they can't erase it. Bitcoin exists wherever there is an internet connection, and even where there isn't, it finds ways to persist. This resilience is not accidental. It's the direct result of not needing permission at any stage of its operation. There is no central server to shut down, no headquarters to raid, no leader to arrest. The network doesn't wake up in the morning waiting to see what the law says. And because of that, Bitcoin behaves differently from every financial innovation before it. It doesn't negotiate its right to exist. It doesn't lobby for acceptance. It doesn't compromise its core rules to gain favor. It simply continues to produce blocks one after another on schedule, regardless of public opinion. That quiet consistency sends a powerful message. Systems that depend on approval are always vulnerable to denial. Systems that don't ask cannot be refused. Bitcoin doesn't win by being louder, faster, or more persuasive. It wins by being indifferent. Indifferent to authority, indifferent to ideology, indifferent to fear. It offers a simple proposition. If you want to participate, the door is open. If you don't, the system moves on without you. And that is why, long before price, headlines, or hype, Bitcoin's most radical feature was never technical. It was philosophical. It was the idea that money no longer needed anyone's permission to exist. Every system reveals its true nature under pressure. Centralized systems break when the people at the center make mistakes, face incentives, or feel threatened. History is filled with examples of currencies that worked perfectly until they didn't. Not because the math failed, but because humans intervened. Rules were bent, supply was expanded. Exceptions were made just this once, and each exception quietly transferred power away from the many and toward the few. Bitcoin was designed with a different assumption that power should not depend on trust in human restraint. By removing the need for permission, Bitcoin removes the most common failure point in any system: authority. There is no emergency switch, no override, no room for interpretation when things get uncomfortable. The rules that apply when everything is calm are the same rules that apply during crisis. That rigidity is often criticized, but it is precisely where Bitcoin's strength lies. In permission systems, rules exist until they are inconvenient. In Bitcoin, inconvenience changes nothing. This is why Bitcoin behaves less like a company or a product and more like a law of nature. Gravity doesn't care about your intentions. Time doesn't pause for political necessity. Bitcoin, in its own way, follows the same logic. Blocks are produced, transactions are validated. Supply issuance continues on a predictable path, immune to public sentiment. That predictability has profound consequences. For individuals living in stable economies, this might sound abstract. But for millions of people, it is deeply practical. When inflation eats away at savings, when capital controls trap wealth inside failing systems, when accounts can be frozen for saying the wrong thing or being in the wrong place, permissionless money stops being an experiment. It becomes a lifeline. In those environments, Bitcoin is not competing with credit cards or mobile apps. It's competing with nothing, because nothing else works. The ability to store value without asking, to move it across borders without paperwork, to protect it from dilution without lobbying power. These are not ideological luxuries. They are survival tools. And once people experience that level of autonomy, it's almost impossible to convince them to give it back. This is where the deeper shift begins. Not just in finance, but in how people relate to authority. A system that cannot be stopped forces institutions to adapt rather than dictate. When control is no longer guaranteed, persuasion replaces enforcement. Service replaces dominance. That is an uncomfortable transition for systems accustomed to compliance. Bitcoin doesn't overthrow institutions. It ignores them. That distinction matters. Revolutions provoke resistance. Alternatives provoke comparison. Bitcoin doesn't demand allegiance. It simply offers an exit. And exits change behavior faster than protests ever could. When people know they have a choice, power dynamics shift. Banks must compete. Governments must consider consequences. Policies must earn trust rather than assume it. None of this happens overnight, but the direction is clear. Critics often argue that Bitcoin enables bad actors. But permission systems have enabled corruption, censorship, and abuse at massive scale for centuries. The difference is not that Bitcoin introduces risk, it redistributes it, from the center to the edge, from institutions to individuals. That redistribution scares those who benefit from centralized control, because a system that cannot say no cannot selectively enforce yes. It cannot favor insiders. It cannot quietly punish dissent. It treats everyone the same, whether that's convenient or not. And that sameness is radical. Bitcoin doesn't know if you're rich or poor. It doesn't know if you're popular or marginalized. It doesn't know if you're aligned with power or opposed to it. All it knows is whether your transaction follows the rules. This removes a subtle but powerful tool from the hands of authority: discretion. Discretion is where bias lives. It's where exceptions are made. It's where power hides. By eliminating discretion, Bitcoin doesn't create utopia. It creates clarity. And clarity has consequences. Once people understand that money can exist without permission, it becomes harder to accept systems that require it. The question stops being, is this allowed? And becomes, why should anyone be able to stop me? That question is dangerous to any structure built on control. Bitcoin's greatest threat is not volatility or energy usage or technical complexity. It's the idea it normalizes. The idea that access to value should not be conditional. That ownership should be absolute. That rule should be enforced by code, not by people with incentives. This is why Bitcoin doesn't need to convince the world. It only needs to continue existing. As long as it runs, it demonstrates a truth that cannot be unseen. Systems without permission are harder to corrupt, harder to capture, and harder to kill. And once that truth takes root, the balance of power never fully returns to where it was. Bitcoin has never claimed to be perfect. It doesn't promise comfort. It doesn't protect people from their own mistakes. It doesn't smooth out volatility or shield emotions from fear. In fact, it often does the opposite. It exposes weakness. It demands responsibility. It punishes carelessness without apology. And yet, block after block, it keeps running. That quiet persistence is easy to underestimate. In a world obsessed with upgrades, announcements, and authority figures, Bitcoin offers none of that. There is no leader to reassure the public, no press release to calm markets, no emergency meeting when things go wrong. The network doesn't explain itself. It simply continues. This is where many critics misunderstand Bitcoin. They evaluate it as if it were a company or a policy experiment, expecting it to respond to pressure the way institutions do. But Bitcoin doesn't negotiate. It doesn't compromise its core rules to gain approval. It doesn't adapt to power. It forces power to adapt to it. That's why it survives every attempt to dismiss it. When governments criticize it, Bitcoin doesn't argue back. When media outlets declare it dead, Bitcoin doesn't respond. When markets crash and sentiment turns dark, Bitcoin doesn't pause to regain confidence. It produces the next block on schedule, indifferent to narrative. That indifference is not arrogance. It's design. Because Bitcoin does not need permission, it cannot be denied. You can regulate companies, you can license exchanges, you can influence behavior at the edges, but the system itself remains out of reach. It exists wherever people choose to run it. As long as a single node remains, the idea lives on. Over time, this changes how people think about money. Bitcoin stops being a bet on technology and becomes a lesson in sovereignty. It forces individuals to confront a question most systems avoid asking. Do you actually want control over your wealth? Or do you just want convenience? Control is heavier than it looks. It comes with anxiety, responsibility, and risk. Not everyone wants it. Bitcoin doesn't judge that choice. It simply makes an alternative available for those who do. And that availability matters more than adoption numbers or price charts. Because once an alternative exists, the monopoly on permission is broken forever. Even if Bitcoin were frozen in time today, the idea it introduced could not be erased. Money without permission changes expectations. It changes what people tolerate. It changes what institutions can get away with. In the long run, Bitcoin doesn't win by replacing everything. It wins by redefining the baseline. It sets a new standard that other systems are forced to measure themselves against. Are you transparent? Are you neutral? Can you be trusted when it matters most? Most systems fail that comparison, not because they are malicious, but because they are human. Bitcoin removes the human layer where power accumulates. That doesn't make it warm. It makes it fair in a way that feels almost uncomfortable. Fairness without empathy, rules without exceptions, freedom without a safety net. And yet, for many, that trade is worth it. Because the most dangerous moment in any system is when permission is withdrawn. Bitcoin was built to make that moment impossible. There is no office to close, no policy to change overnight, no authority that can decide you are no longer welcome. If you have the keys, you have access. Always. That single principle is why Bitcoin continues to exist despite opposition from nearly every traditional center of power. Not because it asked to be allowed, but because it never needed to. In a world where almost everything meaningful requires approval, the thing that doesn't becomes unstoppable. Bitcoin doesn't win because everyone agrees with it. It wins because agreement is optional. It doesn't win because it is loved. It wins because it cannot be stopped. And long after the noise fades, after debates move on and headlines change, Bitcoin will still be there, quietly producing blocks, enforcing the same rules, offering the same choice. Permission or freedom? The world may take a long time to decide. Bitcoin already has.